Ladies and gentlemen, Rex Bear League Project. How the heck are you? Stand by. I just have to hit the mute button here. Otherwise, we're going to get an echo, echo, echo. We have the man, the legend, the way of life, Mr. Gordon White himself. Really excited to speak with him. And I've noticed that we've already got a huge live audience here that's excited to hear what you have to say. You've got a really cool site, Rune. And one of the things I like about you, Gordon, is you're a deep researcher. We're going to get into multiple topics today. Oh, you hear that, ladies and gentlemen? That was an advertisement came on. I need to hit the skip button here on that. So apologize. I told you guys that there was going to be that noise there. But there is a really cool commercial on right now. If you guys want to watch it, I would definitely recommend. Just joking. Just joking. All right. So here's what we're going to talk about today, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get into the House of the Dragon. How far back does that go? What is the dragon? What is the mythology to that? We're going to talk about chaos magic and what it actually is. How do you get proven results with the craft? What about Solomon, King Solomon, Solomonian magic? I might have said that wrong. The keys of Solomon. A lot to discuss. We're also going to get into the ancient Mesopotamian creation story and how it compares to the Nordic mythos and other creation stories as well. So it's an honor to speak with you, Gordon. How the heck are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Last time you were on the show, we definitely shattered some paradigms. You brought a lot to the table. And I feel that this one's going to be just as good, if not even better, because every time we've talked, there's just been something new presented. So let's, for the audience, because the channel's grown a little bit since we talked last, and not everybody knows about you and your story. So tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. Yes, my name's Gordon. I run a website and weekly podcast called Rune Soup. And I have, in the last year and a bit, published 3 books. One's called Starships, A Prehistory of the Spirits, which probably has some of the draconian stuff you're referring to. Another book, Chaos Protocols, which is a practical magic book, and a third one which is called Pieces of 8, which is a specifically chaos magic book. And I born and raised Australian. I've lived in New Zealand and the UK, back in Australia now. What else? Just bought a farm, so I'm moving to southern Tasmania next year. That's me. I'm a author and podcaster and chaos magician, and researcher and speaker, and a triple threat all around.
Full threat. Right on. So what is a chaos magician? What is your definition of chaos magic?
Chaos magic is a it's a modern Western form of magic that emerged in mostly North London in the mid-'80s, at a time when the general magical world was quite moribund. On the sort of thelemic side, there was what usually happens with occultists is sort of ongoing arguments and all this kind of thing. And it kind of staggered out of the 70s with fights among the Thelemites and a lot of kind of Age of Aquarius nonsense. And so this sort of group of practical magicians in North London were looking at what kind of iconoclastic ways of exploring which parts work, which parts you don't need, and so on. And it has a kind of spooky name because it's called chaos magic, right? But this is the fault of Peter J. Carroll, who is one of its founders. And at the time, with people who are out there old enough will remember, there was the sort of first popular mathematics book about chaos theory. It was called Chaos by James Gleick, and it had just come out. And that kind of idea of looking at probability and fractals and so on, it kind of inspired them to say, well, are there empirical modes that we can adopt to see what works in magic and what doesn't, and so on. So it had it was hyper-focused in the same way the sort of English cunning traditions were in achieving practical results, rather than the mysticism that you get with more of a Golden Dawn approach. So that's generally the story of chaos magic. And Pete in particular published a few books, which were then picked up by Wiser, which is, of course, a US publisher. And that kind of, it was big in the 90s as a result, when once it reached American shores. And it has some very good points to it. And like all of these systems, it has some shortcomings. But that's chaos magic. It's a somewhat iconoclastic approach to practical enchantment that has a hyper focus on results for better or for worse.
Give us a quick example, if you would.
Goodness. Well, I guess it's the practical enchantment system that it's known most for is essentially sigil magic and its own particular version of it. Because when you talk about sigils and magic, you can go back 50,000 years to cave painting, essentially, because with a cave painting, what you were doing is encoding or physically describing a concept or a state that you want. So the chaos magic approach to sigils, principally pioneered by Pete, is inspired by the work of a early 20th century London artist called Austin Osman Spare. And you essentially kind of create statements of intent and use this process of kind of removing or striking out some of the letters and then activating the subsequent sigil or little pictogram that you make. And so that's a good example of the iconoclasm, because if you look back at, say, Northwest European magic over the previous centuries, creations of similar things like astrological talismans and so on require a lot of things that the general idea behind chaos magic was, well, dispense with it. So do I actually need gold to make a talisman of the sun? And do I actually need mercury to make a talisman of Mercury and all that kind of stuff? And it seems to work. It works differently, but that's the kind of idea of what that's the ethos behind chaos magic and I think the bit that people fail to consider is, if you don't get the results, you have to kind of go backwards and say, okay, well, maybe there is a part of the system or a part of the process that is in fact essential to it. So it's almost like experimental cooking or experimental archaeology or something. But sigil magic kind of is its defining. I mean, there are plenty of other things, but that's what it's known for, and it's also a very good example of the stripped down iconoclasm that you find in it.
Well, I'm muted, aren't I? Hello.
You are. Yeah.
You were supposed to read my lips, ladies and gentlemen. They're like, we know what he's saying. We've watched enough of these podcasts. Okay, so I was discussing how sigils, when I used to really be into creation of sigils and doing specific mantras, I read that you weren't supposed to use the vowels and second letters and stuff like that, and you combine everything into a formula. And it's interesting how effective they can be. I find it fascinating. So I think you interpreted that very well. And, you know, one thing that I think would be a huge discussion point that a lot of people I know are going to want to hear about, including myself, is the house of the dragon. You've done some serious research and you've gone very far back. So let's talk about that mythos and what the dragon actually is.
Yeah, so in Starships, I relied heavily on the work of a Harvard Indologist by the name of Dr. Witzel. And he came up with this scheme, and it's one of those remarkable things that it's almost a new I don't want to damn it with faint praise or anything. It's almost like a new golden bough or something. It's the kind of thing you can only do at the end of your academic career, which is to build this giant meta schema. And his book on the origins of the world's mythologies is exactly that. After sort of 50 years of working in Vedic mythology and all this kind of stuff, he realized that you can probably do like a family tree of different motifs that appear around the world in mythology. So world egg, the separation of, Father Heaven and Mother Earth, killing the dragon, the flood, the apocalypse, all these different motifs that recur all over the world. Because if you look through, say, alternate history or alternate research or so on, they kind of just play bingo up and down the timeline with motifs and say, and therefore the queen is a lizard or something. But if you actually look at it, what Dr. Witzel showed, I think, and he was very humble about it and said, look, this is a first guess. It's the beginning of a new way of kind of looking at mythology, so some of it's going to be wrong. But he managed to kind of go backwards, potentially to beyond 65,000 years ago, by sort of climbing up the family tree of these different motifs. And one of the earliest ones, so probably at a time depth of about 65,000 years ago, is some form of dragon. or large monster like mother monster like Tiamat, and in particular the killing of it by a culture hero. And there are a number of, and this is, if you think about how family trees work, this is a very good, I don't even want to call it a guess. The hypothesis is this is why you find the dragon motif covering most of the planet, because at 65,000 years ago, if you consider the human population of the planet out of Africa between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, if you can find some beliefs that they would have held, then it stands to reason that they would take them with them as they populated the earth. So that's his idea of how old the dragon is, and kind of why we see it so, everywhere around the world. And as to what the dragon represents, well, that's even more interesting. And these are sort of guesses, right? There is, if you consider, say, Marduk and Tiamat, something about what you tend to find is that this giant monster or dragon is carved up and rearranged, and the culture hero makes the entire universe out of it. So it's quite possible that with the dragon, what you are seeing is the idea of a living universe that then is kind of like rearranged by a new political system. And given that the majority of the time, and this is where it gets really tenuous, right? But given that the majority of the times the dragon is, or the mother of dragons or the mother of monsters is female, and the culture hero is typically male, that there is some suggestion that you kind of have remembered in the mythology around the world of that potential reorganization out of a Paleolithic mode into a more organized one that has things like kingship and more of a social stratification in that sense. So the dragon is fascinating because it's almost the forgotten notion that the universe is in fact alive.
You brought up Tiamat, and I remember reading the creation mythos of these. Tiamat is discussed, and there's this layer of Tiamat, and some people think that's the planet. And then, so you're saying you feel that's more of like a water animal or a large creature.
Tiamat's interesting because it's kind of like the cleanest. The thing about Sumerian mythology is we don't have that much in the way of contemporaneous Sumerian mythological stories. We have Babylonian survivals of them or whatever. So they're about 1,000 years later, but we can kind of guess at about a 3,500 BC. That's where they fade from view at 3,500 BC. The thing about that is, if you look at the archaeology of the general area, the cultures that we call Sumerian are much older than that. And it seems that they are, in fact, in some way, shape, or form, a kind of pre-Ice Age culture. And there are, in fact, quite a few of them around the world. This is what my book Starships is about. So we don't really know how far back it goes. But when it comes to whether it means, this is the challenge with looking at astrotheology. Because of that, when we get to the kind of alternate history mania of the 20th century, so Zecharia Sitchin and so on, they're looking at these stories, and these stories are associated with the stars because we get at least one current of European astrology from the Mesopotamian line. We also get it through Egypt, right? And it kind of blends in the Eastern Mediterranean in the first few centuries AD. And we also have these very large numbers. And that's where I think we kind of went awry by taking these things literally, because the numbers, and I go through this in the book in Starships, right? If you look at the kings, all have processional numbers. So the first Sumerian king ruled for 28,800 years, which goes into the kind of giant Vedic number 150 times. And then you kind of have different versions of it. So 86,400, 36,000 years, 36 is a decanic number. And so you have this kind of even division. And what that suggests is this idea that they're talking mythologically rather than literally. And bear in mind, when I say mythology, I don't mean made up, because that's not how mythology works. As Professor Tolkien says, myths describe things that never happen but always are. And I think we've kind of gone awry by being a little bit too literal with the association of the stars and Sumer. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't, and in fact, I am an interventionist. That doesn't mean there wasn't, shall we say, interactions that we would call UFO today, whatever the UFO is, right? It's just that I don't think it is aliens descending in nuclear-powered rocket ships to make humans, to mine gold, to fix their atmosphere. That's a very 20th century Cold War simplification that is, and a literalization and a focus on materialism that I think sends people awry. Now, coming back to your question about Tiamat as a result, what we have with the story of Tiamat and the Tablets of Destiny and Marduk and all this is a battle over the right to rule. So Marduk is not only Tiamat's grandson, but he essentially has to seize power because Tiamat gives the right to rule. And that's what the Tablets of Destiny are, and so on. So that's kind of what the battle is. And I suspect that is why you have bloodline families and people who are very high up having draconian motifs, because in some way, shape, or form, for a lot of the world, the dragon and the dragon form is associated with the right to rule. And that's a very long-lived idea as far as we can see, looking at, mythology and history and so on.
It's interesting because I went through the Sumerian king list, which the names that they have link up to the names in the Holy Bible. The timelines are similar. That if you look at how long they were supposed to rule versus what the Hebrew translations say, or what we have access to now, they're not the same. But the connections of the beings seem to be pretty spot on, the descriptions. So I like how you just explained the mythos and the J.R. Tolkien description of that. I think that was beautiful. That was such a neat way to put it. So let's get back to the House of the Dragon then. Let's go back 60, 70,000 years, wherever it began. And do you think that there were dragons, like physical dragons, that we would look at in Hollywood and say, there's a dragon. It's, it's protecting its treasures. It's got flames coming out of its mouth. It's got protection of this scaled armor. What is the dragon?
Well, that's a difficult one to kind of definitively answer. What I will say is this. Dr. Jacques Vallée, in his book Wonders in the Sky, says that the best, which is a look back through historical documents around the world for evidence that we would today interpret as UFO phenomena, whatever they happen to be, right? And he says the best cases for that, the things that match modern day UFOs the most are ancient Chinese stories of the dragon. Because actually, if you look at how they describe the different scales, they're essentially describing colored lights and landings and all this kind of stuff. Now, that doesn't mean dragons are UFOs. That means these phenomena have been interacting with mankind for a very long time. And today we interpret them in a kind of technocratic worldview as UFOs, as artificial craft, because there was not any of that kind of stuff in ancient China, or dare we speculate 60,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. You're going to have a much more organic and analog way of telling those same encounter stories. And I think in that sense, some parts of the dragon are literal, but you're kind of getting to this, to a question that's longer and more challenging to answer, which is there anything, does materialist science correctly describe the origins of life on Earth and the origins of humans? And in both cases, the answer to that is no. So you kind of go, no, these are not sufficient answers. And at the same time, the earliest mythologies we have involve these kind of flying beings associated with kingship and even civilization and the kind of gifting of skills to mankind and so on. Now, you don't even need to be physical about that. We were going to talk about mushrooms later, but any of these kind of altered state of consciousness, if your consciousness is sufficiently altered, you will encounter non-human entities. And so I don't know is the answer to whether the dragons are a 60,000-year-old description of events that we would consider UFOs. I think that's at least partially correct. But by the same token, even if you don't think that, you don't need to, because they didn't have the same idiotic split of mind and matter, that sort of Cartesian split that modern Europeans or, the modern West has. They didn't have that idiotic split, so they had a different ontology of dreams and the dream world. So when they were talking about dream encounters, as we should today, they have a reality to them. They're not an equivalent reality, although in some cases they are. And so you don't even really need some kind of dragon spaceship to land. And this is where 20th century, and I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for Sitchin, but because he was correct in the sense that the Sumerian myths are telling us something that is not allowed to be explored in traditional history, in traditional Assyriology. So he was correct in that. His subsequent version or interpretation of it was too materialist. And so he realized there's a weird story going on there, but he made it physical and tried to sound all sciencey. And that's a problem, because you're still falling into this kind of Cartesian materialist mindset. And if you were talking about actual magic and spirits and so on, you're just not using the right epistemology to achieve a sufficient model of it. And that was the point of Starships. And that's why when it's like, well, what are the dragons? What happened at 65,000 years ago, or what have you? Probably something weird. Probably something weird is my answer to that, because it is an unusual motif. It's reptilian and it has big teeth and so on. So you can make the flimsy evolutionary psychology case that it's because we vaguely remember being monkeys and we were scared of snakes and so on. But it's not a snake. It's a dragon. Snakes are also there at around the same time depth, but it is very specifically a dragon. So whatever it was, it stayed with us.
It's interesting because the snake and the serpent is discussed throughout many stories and scriptures as well, different religions. And it seems like many of these kind of have a very similar underlying theme. If you look at Anu, Enki, and Enlil, I think of Odin, Thor, and Loki. And the connections are abundant with the descriptions of these characters. So like you brought up the mythology before, it's stuff that's actually happening, but those characters might not be real, but the mythology is pretty much the way that I interpreted what you said about J.R. Tolkien's description, correct?
Yeah, it is. And also, it's not at all surprising that when you get to Northern Europe, you have similar motifs, because they are much younger cultures than Sumer. And in fact, if you look at, say, Sumerian cosmologies, and if you look at the cosmologies expressed in the Vedas, and I do this in Starships, and you get into dangerous territory here, because the kind of history of anthropology, even the history of histories, so the historiography of Eurasia is tied up with a lot of imperial expansion and kind of racist ideas, where Europeans would look at the Indians and effectively see this amazing culture and more or less say, well, you guys couldn't have done this, so it has to have come from some vanished race of Aryans somewhere in Eurasia. And you have these sort of diffusionist models of a culture that literally doesn't exist. Nevertheless, the fact that there are overlaps, and this is why it's dangerous, because we have to look at that again, and that's what Dr. Witzel did. We have to look again at the overlaps in Eurasian cultures across time in a way that's non-racist. So we don't say like, well, white people have to have given this to you, some vanished race of white people, because you're too dumb to do it. Now, that's obviously not correct. And what he does, when you look at it, it's kind of going back up that family tree. There's some really interesting stuff in the Vedas and Sumerian mythology that suggests that at least at a time that the 15,000 BC, we can sort of squint down to a pan-Eurasian cosmology. And that's why you can kind of get motifs that look like kissing cousins between American First Nations people, because if you're at a 12 to 15,000 year time gap, First Nations people, well, 2/3 of them, it came from Eurasia. So you can look at that, and you can look at the Vedas, and you can look at Sumer, and this is how the family tree model works. You find the recurring motifs, and you kind of jump up or jump back in time 10,000 years and go, well, the last time they all overlapped was here and then. And so that's how we built his schema. And he went the whole way back to before humans left Africa, as you can kind of whittle down these motifs. And the dragon or a giant snake that also probably shaped the landscape, and we find that in the rainbow serpents in Aboriginal Australia, is there at the very beginning as the trickster teacher of civilization. So something that sort of was either sent by a high creator god, or is the high creator god, and it comes to Earth and shapes things and gives mankind its taboos and hunting technology and leaves. And now that's interesting when we come back to what Dr. Vallée said about the Chinese having the best written examples of phenomena that we would call UFO today, that all the way in this scheme of Dr. Witzel's, all the way at the very beginning, so at about 70,000 years ago, we have this particular motif, and it looks for all the world, and I consider this is because the UFO versions of it are misinterpreted, it looks for all the world like these stories you have that the demons, for want of a better word, but the spirits gave mankind hunting technology and metallurgy and so on, may be tumbled down remembrances of some kind of actual occurrence.
Jeez. So you also get into a lot about beings that we can't see. And there was a comment that's actually on your website, how other kinds of beings see us matters. The other kinds of beings see us change things. If jaguars also represent us in ways that can matter. So let's talk about that. Do you believe in like sylphs and glyphs and entities that we're not seeing with our physical eyes that have a very big influence?
So that is a quotation from Dr. Eduardo Cohn. So at runesoup.com, we have a premium membership where each quarter we go through different courses. And speaking of sigils, the first one was and they're all still available if you join now, the sigil course and so on. And we did a history of grimoires, and then we did a journeying course. And there are some, in Pieces of Eight, I sort of make the case that even in the alternate world, the most popular models for describing reality are kind of insufficient. So materialism we can dispense with; it's falsified. Panpsychism, I think, is the same thing. I think it's a halfway fudge to try to keep materialism alive and kicking, but it doesn't solve consciousness. Then you get to idealism, which is the entire thing is consciousness, and that's better, but it's still not good. And the one I talk about this idea of returning animism to the big table, because I think it belongs at the big table. Animism is essentially the extension of personhood beyond the human. So we have, as a result of Descartes and Kant, located personhood exclusively in the human. And that's just, I don't think that's correct. And we did that because, that's the mind-matter split, and the entire universe is some kind of dead clock, which we can wholly apprehend using our clever reasoning skills. And literally no other culture at any point in time, anywhere in the world, including Europe prior to that, thinks that way. The personhood, a tree can be a person. Well, a tree is a person. Animals are persons. They're just not humans. We've conflated two words that shouldn't be put together. So how other animals see us is an extension of this idea by a Brazilian anthropologist called Eduardo Viveiras de Castro, called perspectivism. And what he did as a way of providing an epistemological model to look at reality and think with the idea of spirits and non-white cultures and so on, he built this model, and it's a academic artifact, but it's a useful one, which is in particularly what we would call animist cultures, interacting with the world relies on perspectivism. So how other animals see us, how other spirits see us, how trees, how ancestors see us, is a method of being in the world that is fundamentally different from how we do it. So as a result, when you say, do you believe in spirits or whatever, the trouble is that question is downstream from a whole bunch of assumptions that are wrong. It's downstream from the rise of empiricism in the age of reason and the split of matter and mind, because you're making the assumption that only, even if you don't believe this, the way the question is phrased is saying that the only thing that exists is material, and that's been falsified. So you actually have to go way back upstream prior to this kind of Cartesian split and think with spirits and think with living forms and so on. And that's animism. That's big table animism. And for the premium members, that has been a long-running project, exploring what that looks like and kind of interrogating the history of Western magic from that perspective. And if people are interested in it, there's loads of stuff on the website, and And obviously in the premium members area if you're super interested in it.
That's great. I appreciate that. And I also got into a conversation the other day about what is the soul. And I think that's a really deep conversation, especially with what you're discussing now. It's interesting that division. So let me ask you this, and I hope that I'm wording this properly. It's going to be a simple question. What is the soul? Do you think that there is a soul, something that's different from everything else?
Again, interestingly, the church fathers solved a lot of this, for better or for worse. So we're now having these conversations. What happened? No, we start here. What happened with the rise of empiricism was you essentially have a split. So Descartes and to some extent Kant split the worlds and said that, like, I think therefore I am. So there is just the mental and it is wholly separate from the physical. And out of that we get this sense of empiricism, which is you can apply that nothing exists beyond our sense data, and by rigorously analyzing the results of our sense data we can make these statements. The trouble is, so there's no metaphysical reality in empiricism. The trouble is the statement that empiricism can describe universal realities is a metaphysical statement. So it sort of falsifies itself. But they forgot this. So it's a sort of theological argument that falsifies itself. And we have these discussions about soul downstream from this hit. And it's not very good, because if you go backwards, you actually have several centuries of philosophers looking at the difference between soul and spirit and person within a kind of, late classical era. And they actually sit with these ideas in a way that's probably more sophisticated than we do today, because we have a binary question, soul or not. But we've also done something we also have a low resolution view of what the soul is, because we've bundled in soul and spirit and personhood and then decided whether or not that exists. And so the short answer is yes, of course. There is a soul. The longer answer is, usually if you try to have this discussion without specifying your kind of underlying metaphysics, then people end up talking about different things. But yeah, absolutely. And in a perspectivist model, or in animist cultures, personhood and soul and spirit are different, and they're constituted differently in different contexts. So there's just a lot. It's almost like a shortcut into a more satisfying philosophy, to be looking at what other cultures who didn't have the same head trauma that we did, how they think about these things, or how they think with these things. So yes, to answer your question, of course there is a soul. And if you look in the kind of at a church father level, so the philosophical exploration from about 300 to 800 AD, you get soul and spirit and personhood in really potentially enriching ways to go and look at.
Fantastic. Thank you for describing it that way. And in a minute, we're going to get into the hyperdimensional mushrooms and Star Trek Discovery. I really like the new series. I think it's fascinating. I think they're taking it's a little bit of a different kick than most of the Star Treks previously. Sure. I mean, even now they're using a war machine. It's a war machine. It's not just for exploration. And the captain's, he's crazy, but he's also genius at the same time. And, let's talk about that after this question. What do you think about the Emerald Tablets of Thoth that people have access to?
The Emerald Tablet of Hermes is an idea that shows up in Europe 12th century in a weird way. It comes in through Moorish Spain, and it shows up in the kind of troubadour legends, and it shows up in Parsifal and so on, where in fact it is either a jewel. When Lucifer fell from heaven, a emerald fell from either his crown or his third eye, depending. So we have this motif of an emerald that comes from heaven one way or the other, showing up. And because it came via Moorish Spain, it means it's come from somewhere in the classical world, because obviously the Arab expansion or the Muslim expansion about 6th, 7th century that goes across North Africa and into Spain picks up a whole bunch of the classical world and actually keeps it in a way that Europe doesn't. So the story of the Emerald Tablet is a really clever. I like it. Put it this way: it's a nice and concise, clever, late classical summation of Hermetic cosmology, and so that's what I think it is. But I think it is. It's another one of those survivals of a real thing, and it's a survival of, call it the View from Alexandria. It's this kind of clean and concise worldview that survives in mythology and so on. And what's interesting about it being fallen from heaven is the Hermetic end game is that sort of reascent and identification with the universe, or kind of return to and identification with God. So it's a mystic process. And the fact that it fell from heaven and Hermeticism is so profoundly caught up in Egyptian astrology in particular is interesting, because the sort of implication is that you take it back up to heaven. And the fact that it fell with Lucifer by that time is a very romantic figure. He gets more romantic when the English romantics get a hold of him. But it's the idea that this is not only forgotten wisdom, but it's almost banned. That notion, so there's a kind of whiff of Gnosticism in it. So there's this notion that this information is contraband and you're not supposed to have it, but it's very, very valuable and it can lead you into that re-identification with God. So the Emerald Tablet, I think it's a really beautiful motif, and it's worthy of people kind of studying and having a look at.
Now, have you read the actual, I think there's 14 or 15 tablets, but they're not actual tablets, but they're called the Tablets of Thoth from, 15 of them?
I don't know. If you're talking about what we call, like, Tabulus Meridinga, that's not 15 tablets. That's essentially a poem. So I'm not sure what you are referring to, if it's not an Hermetic text or if it's not this sort of 12th century as above, so below, which is where we get that from. If it's not that essentially poem, then I don't know what you're referring to now.
Okay, yeah, no problem. And let's do this. And thank you for answering that. You did it very well. Much appreciated. And what is the connection here? You wrote about this on runesoup.com. And ladies and gentlemen that are listening to this podcast, definitely go to the website, runesoup.com. You put multiple blogs up and some very interesting mind candy, in my opinion. So let's talk about the multi-dimensional mushrooms and Star Trek Discovery.
Sure. Everyone who's listening is probably aware of Terence McKenna. And Terence said a lot of things about mushrooms, to be fair, over the course of his life. Some of them designed to shock or jolt. Some of them he believed. Some of them maybe he didn't, certainly not by the end of his life. But one of the things he said, and this is based on not just his, but his brother Dennis's sort of speculations and research as well, is he developed this idea that the mushroom came from space. Now, the spores can survive in space. Anything that is a spore can more or less survive in space. But not just that the psilocybin mushroom came from space, and the entity that is it, which is majority non-physical. So it has this sort of, a tiny fraction of it is physical, which we see as the actual mycelium. And the rest of it is this non-physical connected consciousness spreading out across the galaxy that can't die. Because there's a video you'll find of him kind of giving this presentation, which is essentially mycelium is effectively immortal, assuming we don't toxify the planet too much or the star doesn't blow up. It lives forever. And also, when you live forever, spores can take however much time they want to get between planets, because you have a different sense of time. It's kind of like Ents, speaking of Tolkien. If you live forever, if it takes you 150,000 years to get from one planet to the other, it's a day, right? Because there's no time for you. And this mythology is that the mushroom spreads itself out across the galaxy in spore form to interact and experience and accelerate the ascension into consciousness and complexity and essentially becoming spacefaring of different cultures around the world, around the galaxy rather. And it's just one of those, it's a very Terence idea, because none of it is scientifically incorrect. It's just really, really poetic. Like spores can survive in space and so on. And so there's this guy, Paul Stamets, who's probably the world's biggest mushroom nerd now. And he was friends with, well, he's still friends with Dennis, but he knew Terence and so on. And he's kind of picked this idea up, as well as the Stone hypothesis, which is another McKenna Boys idea, which is that encounter rates with psychedelic mushrooms contributed to the development of the human brain going back in time before we sort of split from other hominins. And so Paul Stamets is this mushroom guy, and he picks up on this idea, and then all of a sudden we switch on Star Trek Discovery, and their mushroom node is called Paul Stamets. And the show is about a mycelial network spread across the galaxy that allows hyperdimensional travel and communication. And I just think that's lovely. I think that's, again, there's nothing preventing it from being true. The spores can survive in space. And actually, I don't know if I mentioned, but I'm a permaculture designer, amongst other things. And one of the many questions to do with the formation of soil on Earth in the first place, because everyone out there is probably directed panspermian theorist in some way, shape, or form. Like this is still that, or the underwater volcanoes, which I don't think are a sufficient enough solve, are the two kind of best guesses for how life first showed up on Earth. So directed panspermia is a sort of squishy rock. It has bacteria and it hits Earth, and from there life kind of unpacks. The trouble is, the water, which we also don't know where it came from, because there aren't enough impact craters to balance out the volume of water that's on this planet. So that kind of guess that it showed up in chunks of ice and so on is not yet adequate. But to have life grow, it needs to grow in soil, and to build soil, you need a soil biome, which is majority mycelial in an old-growth forest. But as a general rule, you kind of have bacteria and mycelium and nematodes and all this kind of stuff. So you kind of can't have soil to grow life without the mushroom or without mycelium. And the current idea is that bacteria kind of quickly evolved into mycelium, and they both work together to build a soil that they both need to live. And it's all nonsense. So the mushroom probably did come from space. It probably literally came from space, because without it, we wouldn't have the sort of soil formation organisms that we would need to hold the water to build the rest of life. And I just find that very interesting. I find it very interesting that Terence specifically said the psilocybin mushroom came from space. But nevertheless, if you dig into the idea of directed panspermia, it probably did have to happen. Not necessarily the psychedelic, although why not, given that it appears to be such an important part of the spiritual experience on Earth. But nevertheless, it looks like the mushrooms came from space. And here we are with Star Trek talking about that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting connection that you just put together there. And also, I'd be interested to know more. If you go to runesoup.com, you talk about eonography. And then there's this one line that says, the demon began to make eons in the likeness of the real eternal realms. What does that mean?
Well, that's it's a Gnostic description, essentially. So you have a Gnostic cosmology that the world, the universe is the creation not of the true God, but a demiurge, so a lesser being. And after that, Gnosticism kind of splits into whether that's exclusively bad, or whether the demiurge is exclusively bad, or whether it's just a thing of creation, and so on. And the thing about Gnosticism is it's a very useful idea to sit with. I wouldn't describe myself as a Gnostic, but I am always kind of I always get more out of Gnostic motifs and mythologies and gospels every time I look at them. And what's so fascinating is, to me anyway, the Gnostics were obsessed with origins in the same way we kind of are, in the same way. And it's what makes ancient alien theory Gnostic. because they were obsessed in particular with Genesis, and they're trying to solve. I once said that the most Gnostic movie ever is Dude, Where's My Car? Because that's the Gnostics. They know something happened. They're not supposed to be here, and they try to find out what that is by delving deeply. Because the scientific approach, because there was no science, the scientific approach would have been rigorous analysis of the texts of Genesis to find out what's going on. And we're sort of doing the same thing. So I use a lot of Gnostic motifs when when we look at this kind of stuff, because if you kind of see through to their, what's the word, their state of mind or the question that they're trying to solve, it's the same question we're trying to solve.
Man, I haven't seen that movie in a long time, but that is funny.
It's not even a good movie, but it was, I just kind of mentioned it once, like, it's literally like Dude, Where's My Car? Because every time you get these flashes of, well, that's weird, and that's even weirder, and then I was there. And think about what we were just talking about, squishy rocks and, super viruses and mushrooms and things coming from space. Not just that, but that the mushroom is a majority non-physical form that has this unbelievably ancient super personality. And it kind of reminded me of anything, Dude, Where's My Car? Because you start at this innocuous level, but each time you go back to go, well, that doesn't make sense, and I need to look at this, it just really quickly gets really, really weird, and we'll never know. And, the car is some kind of, I don't know, in some giant mushroom city in the center of the galaxy, maybe.
Let's talk about this for a minute, because some people have had experiences before where they've really been able to download information from certain mushrooms, etc. So do you think it's a way you can actually kind of like have a connection point possibly to download enormous amount? No, you think that you could bring in some darker entities as well if you were opening portals with those things?
That's kind of coming back to the dragon thing. That's exactly what I think happened. So last year I gave a presentation at the London Occult Conference called Campfire's Edge, and it is about, which is available in the premium members area now, but it's about that, this idea that the spirits gave mankind all these things, astronomy and hunting technology and so on. And that's fundamentally what separates us out from the rest of the natural kingdom. And I talk about it a bit in Pieces of 8 too. And so the mushroom is one way of doing it. Now you have to remember that 300,000 years ago to about 800,000 years ago, whenever it was that physical humans, rather than other hominins, because Neanderthal used it and whatever, invented fire, there's only 20,000 of us maximum on the entire planet. The planet is full of things, some of which eat us. The only light at night is the stars and the campfire. And at the very edge of the campfire, with this brand new technology, the sort of motif is the spirits are there at campfire's edge, and you interact with them. And the point is that when you say, can you bring in dark entities, we're throwing morality at something whose ultimate motive, we don't know what it is. And that is another Valet interpretation, which is that whatever these forms that we currently call UFOs are, they are affecting our mythology and popular culture and leading us in a specific direction, and we don't know why. And this comes back to the sort of thing Charles Fort said as well, which is where he thinks we're property. It's an open question whether, because I think the interaction with the spirit world is an essential component to all forms of cultural innovation. And if you think about the sort of pivot points in history, even something simple like LSD, but any of these kind of dramatic developments, they are always associated with some kind of weird mystic state. So through this kind of membrane that is Campfire's Edge, so where it's not light and where it's not dark, where the spirits can kind of throw in things like hunting technology and whatever, human culture changes and human mythology changes and all of it, and now we're spacefaring, and it's not obvious from this behavior or this interaction that they have our best interests at heart. They might not. But bear in mind, the oldest, and as a result, at least for me, I'm a bit biased, cosmologies that allow for things like spirits and technology transfer from the spirit world and interaction and so on, have a deeply ambivalent view to spirits. Again, in European culture, because of this split and things being good and bad and mind and matter and so on, we either think they're dark or that they're good. They're just different. And there's a healthy understanding of that difference that you will find in cultures that you might call shamanic, although there are problems with that term, in a way that we don't. So they will. It's like being in the jungle, or it's like being in the forest and hunting. The jaguar isn't bad. The shark isn't bad, and they have that kind of ecosystemic attitude to the spirit world, which we don't. We either say it's all bad, or it's all bad except for the one that I happen to like, or whatever. And I think that's unwise, given that you can't explain cultural complexity across time on planet Earth without some sort of spirit interaction model.
Okay. And then so you're kind of looking at things as if somebody sees this deity or something that has a very negative force to it, and maybe you're saying that's just it's part of the food chain. There's this one part that I want to talk about from the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, where they discuss these serpent beings that feed through the blood, that work through people of very high positions of power, and how they're basically the dark force, the darker side of things, the black magic. Are you familiar with like the blood sacrifices and stuff that some of these wars tend to? I mean, do you think wars are a big blood sacrifice to these things?
Well, I'm still not sure where these Emerald Tablets of Thoth come from. That doesn't sound that hermetic. So if you want to tell me where they are from, because that sounds kind of like, I don't want to say modern nonsense, but yeah, what are they? When were they written? Because I'll come back to the blood sacrifice question, because I think narrowing down rather than widening out means I only end up answering 15% of the question, and it kind of unbalances.
Okay, great questions. And I have a lot of questions myself about the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. I don't know how old they are, who actually wrote them. I will tell you this, though, when I read the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, there's so much in there that I feel resonates with me, kind of like the Gnostic stuff, because I've got the Nag Hammadi scriptures. I've read them multiple times, the Secret Book of John, etc. And, some people say, oh, well, the Sumerian tablets are more accurate because they're older. Just because something's older doesn't make it more accurate, obviously. I mean,
no, agreed.
You could write the National Enquirer 5,000 years ago.
Yeah. I don't think older is necessarily better, but I think oldest might be, which we don't have access to. This is why I'm so interested in Dr. Witzel. It's just that I don't know of kind of like, black snake spirits in blood in an historical context that would allow me to answer that question historically. So what I'm going to do is widen it out and say, yes, absolutely. In a model of spirit interaction, you have different ways of thinking about how demons affect mankind. And so you have a basic possession model, for instance, which is why I think the notion that, Dick Cheney and Hillary Clinton and all these people are sort of secret Thelemite Satan worshippers is not correct. But they also wouldn't be aware if they were being ridden by an entity that actually did want to harvest Haiti or collapse Libya or any of these other kind of things. So yes, I think on an almost unconscious level, a lot of blood spilled is bound up with this idea of a kind of semi or entirely permeable membrane between the spirit world and here. So that absolutely, I think, is 1,000,000% correct. It does, you can look at it in a more precise sense and say, yes, there is something about use of blood sacrifices, historically and so on, that allows, it is a food, it seems to be, for certain types of entities, not all of them. But if you think about the Aztecs, for instance, or even just general animal sacrifice, there is something about it that is involved in this extra-dimensional communication. So yes, and as for, say, ritual staged events that we see playing out in the modern world, so we see something like Vegas, I think that was a sacrifice, and I think that was an intentional sacrifice. So you get a lot going on, and that's kind of why I wanted to say I'm unfamiliar with the text. But if you're talking in a macro sense about blood and the spirit world and the general idea of sacrifice, sacrifice is from the Latin, which means to make sacred. So it's essentially giving something to the spirit world. You make it sacred, and that's when you would, if you're Celtic tribes sacrificing things to gods or what have you, you're making it sacred. And that method of interaction is very, very old, and it doesn't exclusively rely on blood, but in some cases it appears to.
Okay, thank you for that. And looks like we've got some questions from the audience here. There's people in the live chat that really appreciate you being here with us. And one of the questions is, what do you think about Franz Barden?
He's fine. Yeah, he's for people listening. It's he's dead now, but a Central European magician and mystic, and he has a fairly invitational system. If you want to work it, I don't. It has too much of the. This is such inside baseball. Too much of the Neoplatonic Renaissance. Quasi-alchemical baggage, so it's not really for me, but it's good. There's nothing. There's really good stuff in it if that's your jam. So he definitely still gets a thumbs up from me. It's just not my road.
Yeah, all right. And what do you mean by that? Some of the Renaissance stuff. I think that's interesting because there's a lot to his work. So I can see. I think I understand what you mean, but I don't know if everybody in the audience does.
So, right. Yeah, because it's a 2,000-year history of magic. Long story short, what happened with the fall of Constantinople was a whole bunch of texts from the classical world showed up in Italy, and in Venice they got much more of the grimoire stuff by the looks of it, and in Florence they got some of that, but they also got Plato and the Hermetica and so on. And this is all under the auspices of the Medici banking family. And you have people like Marsilio Ficino translating this stuff. And it's after a 1,000-year gap, Platonism and Neoplatonism was like blinding, cutting edge. This was the stuff. This is for them, there's that sort of belief we all have, or the feeling that maybe we had spirituality right in an earlier age, and we've somehow fallen away from it. Here it was. Here is this kind of Neoplatonic emanatory idea of this distant and unchanging God kind of beaming down like a radio tower through different layers of reality, all the way down to base matter, which we're in, and we kind of have to climb back up the radio signal to get to God. I don't think that's a very good... That's not an animist cosmology, so I don't really resonate with it. But it was hugely influential and kind of kickstarted a whole bunch of artistic and whatever movements. But everything that kind of came from that sort of Florentine Dame Frances Yates line from Agrippa and so on has some foundational premises that I don't think are... It's one survival, but it's not the survival of the kind of magic that we're generally more interested in, which is the sort of grimoire stuff and spirit interaction. So Franz Barden is in that line. It's in this idea that magic is actually a survival of a high mystic tradition from the ancient past, and you can use it to, find God. I happen to think if you look, and that's valid. Like I happen to think, if you are interested in the mystic path, magic may well be the slowest possible way to get there. But Franz Barden's good in that sense, and it's really good, very invitational, basic techniques. And if you resonate with it, do it. but it's not necessarily. Its problem was it thought it was the whole magic. So Agrippa and all those people who have this reconstructed Neoplatonic view, they thought they were all of magic, and it's not. It's this one kind of weird sliver. The rest of it is much more based in herb lore and saints and spirits of the dead and all that kind of stuff. And that's more where I situate myself.
Okay. And what do you think of the magnum opus, or it's called monatomic gold?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. If I would not be in the least bit surprised if the Egyptians, ancient Egyptians, had, because you can do electroplating with citric acid, right? I would not be in the least bit surprised, given that it's as far as I can tell, and this is in starships as well, things like the Great Pyramid were built using not high technology, but methods of working with stone in an almost a concrete fashion that we don't really do today. Because these guys, what chemicals to us, well, if you consider our relationship to chemicals, that was them and stone. They were that good at stone in a way that we just aren't. Like it's astounding. And as a result, when it comes to things like gold and metal and so on, I wouldn't be surprised at all if they had electroplating. And so as a result, I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't particular molecular configurations of certain elements like gold that had different statuses and so on in the distant past. As for the kind of wider monoatomic gold alternate story, that it's something to do with, manna and Moses and so on, I'm not sure if that's correct, but as a result, I think that story is wrong, but I would not be at all surprised if they were making the kind of metals that we don't think they can do today, because I think they could.
Yeah, fascinating what the ancient Egyptians can do. I've read through the Book of the Dead several times, and I started having some very bizarre, frightening dreams when I first started reading through the Book of the Dead, and I was like, whoa.
Yeah, well, it's a collection of spells, I remember there was a exhibit on the Book of the Dead a few years ago when I was still in London at the British Museum, and the final exhibit was this big, long room. I think it's the longest scroll of individual scroll, because how it worked for people listening is there isn't one Book of the Dead. As part of your funeral preparations, which included, if you were rich enough, building your tomb and so on, you would go to a scribe and he would put together a collection of spells specific to you to make sure you could get to the part of the afterlife. So that's why there's loads of them and loads of different versions. And this one that they finished the exhibit was, I think it's the longest continuous scroll of it. So I think it was 20th dynasty or 19th dynasty. It's wrapped the whole way around a wall. And it was very unique because it had two different versions of the weighing of the heart. And it was the Book of the Dead for a woman whose father was a scribe in a temple. And she has different hand actions in each of in both weighing of the heart scenes, and you could kind of feel from it that she was a witch, basically. She had obviously stolen or snuck a lot of, or at least some magical or mystical knowledge out of her father's life, because it almost looked like a secret society thing. There is no reason to put two versions of the weighing of the heart in your own individual spell book, unless one of them is the outer church and one of them is the inner church model. So I'm not surprised you got weird dreams out of the Book of the Dead, because it's literally, the culture that is the best in the world. Well, the best in the ancient world at magic. You were reading the spells that they were using to make sure that they live on in the afterlife. So yes, you get weird dreams out of it. It's like eating bad seafood.
Wow. Yeah. Hello. Man, did you guys try that crawfish from Louisiana? They put that Corex on there. It was good. So, can you tell me about the two different versions? I'm fascinated to hear about that.
Literally, yeah, it was kind of, I could feel it, so in a magical sense, but I could also look at it and go, there's no reason for this other than one of them being the public expression of the weighing of the heart and the other one not. That's my interpretation. I went and looked through all the documents at the time, and I don't think anyone else has had it. But I think I can make a pretty good case, because she's the only one who has two weighing of the hearts, and in one of them her arms are in a different position. So it's almost like a secret handshakey kind of thing. And I think she was part of which is, Egyptians had them, everyone had them. Like there's that sort of mystery tradition idea. I think she was part of a specific mystery cult. And you could just kind of see it in the Book of the Dead. The historical artifacts and texts, particularly with the Egyptians, are really, really enigmatic in that sense. And I'm sure people listening will be familiar with, Schuyler de Lubitsch, big, John Anthony West is a big fan of his, and he makes a very good point, which is, and it kind of comes back to that Cartesian materialist hijack. The Egyptians had a symbolic language, and they lived in a world that was entirely based in spirit, so that we can't, the way we do history and the way we do archaeology is coming out of a materialist world. So we can do things like measure the inside of a tomb with a tape measure and all this kind of stuff, but it's not describing it, because things like hieroglyphics aren't the letter A and the letter F and what have you. That it meant five things at once, and it meant five things at once in a particular context. And so that we just don't know. They were playing, they were just on another level when it came to being good at things like magic and sacred architecture, that we just will never get there, I don't think.
Yeah, fascinating indeed. And the next question here is from the audience. Great question, Dallas. What are your impressions of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon and the three different levels of heaven in the LDS religion?
Hi. I always get asked by Americans about Mormons. It's a very American phenomenon. Yeah. It's like Bigfoot. So Bigfoot and Mormons. It's
Bigfoot and Mormons. Bigfoot actually was a Mormon.
Obviously, that's science.
He is a Mormon. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's not obviously that big of a deal anywhere else, because it's an American religion. I don't know that much about his three heavens. I do know that he's essentially a ritual magician. Like, he would go out using these different grimoires and do the treasure hunting thing, and the initial contact with the angel Moroni is actually a form of scrying that you can see centuries earlier in Europe. So I expect that whatever happened to Joseph Smith, it was a real contact event. So and that tends to happen. Like, Dee has that sort of thing. Dr. Rudd, you go back through history, and people are using darkness and crystals and whatever it happens to be, obsidian mirrors and so on, to have a visual interaction with a spirit or entity. So that's where my interest in Joseph Smith begins. So it's essentially, it's not only a modern religion, probably more religions than we think were founded by wizards when you consider it. But in the case of Joseph Smith and LDS, it's literally a wizard-founded religion, and that's kind of cool. That's historically cool.
That's very interesting. I didn't know much about him being a wizard. I heard that he was a Freemason, and there's a lot of Freemasons that have connections to politics, etc. It's funny because
he was out in the woods treasure hunting with treasure hunting manuals, which are a very popular English 17th and 18th century magical books, but even earlier than that, going back to the 15th century. That was the most popular use for grimoires in history, was like to find a spirit that will lead you to treasure. So that, and even the hat scrying, you can find examples of, because what you're doing when you're looking into a hat is making it dark so you can kind of see, and that's a very important part of the spirit interaction. So he's learnt that from magical manuals. I was kind of being a bit poetic maybe by calling him a wizard, but he hands down was using magical manuals to contact angels. And what do you know? He contacted an angel. I think that's really cool.
Wow, that's fascinating. And just, even though that religion you're saying is a U.S. religion, within less than 200 years, they've obtained more money and power than almost any other religion out there besides the Catholic religion. So, most of them are very intelligent people. They're good people. I think they should question more. I've actually gone to these, churches before where they go in there for 3 hours and they're like, yes, I know this church is true. Yes. Okay. And it's like, whoa, man, take a breath. But they're usually really good people. And it's funny because it's, if you bring up, oh, I'm from Utah, people, the first thing they'll typically ask you is, are you Mormon? And if you say you're Mormon, the first thing a lot of people think is, do you have more than one wife? And a lot of times those are the same.
See, I think underpants straight away. I don't think more than one wife. I think when someone tells me they're a Mormon, I'm like, are you wearing your magic underpants?
Right on. See, well, there you go. Because a lot of people just growing up in Utah, and then when I went to other states and people asked where I was from, and I'm not Mormon by any means, no way. I'm totally agnostic. But it's interesting because if you look at a lot of people that ask that question, or people that have asked me that question, they're Christians, and they based on these Abrahamic, religion, fundamental values and stuff. And if you read through the Bible, how many of their coveted leaders had, tons of concubines and all sorts of wives? And
absolutely. But if you consider if you look at any of the prophets in the Old Testament, the story of the prophets is because they have these extra dimensional encounters. So, Ezekiel and what have you, there's nothing in the model that prevents Joseph Smith from being that. And everyone, if you kind of believe something 100%, when we're talking about an organized religion, you need to look at how you're living your life. And that's not just an LDS thing. That's any kind of belief system that you want to tip into 100%. So I don't care at all if people are Mormon or there's literally nothing in the model. Usually when I get asked about it, it's because people are post-Mormon and they haven't, they've realized that it is what it is. And they've kind of moved on from it, but they still have some kind of faith. So they're still Christian in some sense. And they're trying to develop a frame of how they think about Mormonism now that they don't identify as Mormons, but still obviously have family and are sympathetic to it. And for me, that's why I mentioned the kind of wizard thing. For me, there's nothing in the Joseph Smith model that is crazy. I know that sounds weird because if people are unfamiliar with the history of magic, there's literally nothing in the model that's crazy. He was using treasure hunting manuals, which Europeans have used for centuries. He was doing scrying to contact spirits. He contacted a spirit. That's all normal. So if people are trying to work out how they think about Joseph Smith now that they're not Mormons, they go, no, he had a real spirit contact. It's just that it doesn't ever follow that means your religion is correct. It just means you had a real spirit contact.
Well, you brought some information to the table that I hadn't heard before, so much appreciated. That's fascinating. The wizard.
Exactly.
That is
the wizard
wild.
Joseph Smith.
I love it. So let's talk a little bit now about, dang it, where were we going to go with this? Yes, the Tower of Babel and cosmic wars. Now, I just want to give my quick 2 cents, and that's about all it's worth. I think that maybe there was some type of galactic war, whether those people came from here and we created some type of singularity, non-biological entity that just went nuts and started consuming entire swaths of space, like in the Singularity kind of talks a little bit about that. Something happened. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't know if you're familiar with Skeptico, Alex Securis, but I've been on his show a few times. And in fact, in one case, I interviewed Dr. Brandenburg, who is the sort of plasma physicist who I think correctly has identified that in Mars's history about 500 million years ago, there was at least one nuclear blast, an airburst that destroyed a civilization. Because you have a couple of things from the early 80s. He was along with Richard Hoagland, part of the kind of Mars nerds in the early 80s, looking at the Voyager images of the face on Mars and all that kind of stuff. So he was into that. And then as a result of being a plasma physicist and so on, and working in generally top secret areas, he discovered that there is in the atmosphere of Mars an unmistakably artificial signature for a nuclear bomb. And because of half-lives, you can kind of work out that this detonation happened between 250 million and 500 million years ago. And for me, I just find it very interesting that Mars is our war planet, and that's a universal. So everywhere around the world, they call it different things, but it's the planet of war, and it's the only one we can see in our solar system that appears to have literally been bombed from space. And I find that fascinating. So yes, I absolutely do think the true story of our solar system, at least, is older and more violent and a lot more like science fiction than at least we probably think at the time. I expect from about the 70s, this awareness was, well, this hypothesis was considered likely at a very senior level, particularly within the US, and it's sort of fundamentally altered space policy since then. But yeah, 100%. I think I think the ruins on Mars looked artificial anyway, and then I find Dr. Brandenburg's stuff about the bombing, and I've tried everything. I even spoke to him and said, how is there literally any other way, solar plasma ejector that could have altered the atmosphere and so on. I said, I've run through all of that, and if anyone can find something to any other explanation for it, let me know. But I think it's open and shut at this case, rather than I think it's happened. I think we can actually move to the next step and go, well, what happened, rather than if, because 100% that a long time ago this wouldn't have been a great place to be.
And where do you think we go after this?
Space-wise?
After this
physical... Oh, you mean, after death. Right. We go to a... you can call it home. I actually don't think there's anything wrong with being that poetic about it. But this is another one of those things, in a weird way, like the ruins on Mars. The evidence for after-death survival is open and shut. And not only that, 60% of people in the US have admitted to having some form of after-death contact, either dream state or what have you. And also about 60% of people who are subsequently resuscitated have some sort of end-of-life experience, or ELE, where they get either angels or passed over loved ones who come and help them and what have you. So I think you can call it home. We go spirit world, afterlife, whatever you want. And it actually has a geography. So it's not this kind of, we just dissolve into some white light nonsense. That kind of crap version of heaven emerged in the 19th century as the sort of the rapid march of materialist science and all these dumb imperial ideas like Darwinist racial superiority and nothing exists but matter and so on were happening. People who were trying to kind of keep step with science, even though that idea turned out to be wrong, kept moving the definitions or the goalposts of what the afterlife or spirit was to kind of still keep it in this emerging scientific paradigm. And one of the things they said to make it sound all sciencey was like, well, maybe we just, because energy can't end, maybe we just dissolve into some sort of white light and that's God. And that's dumb, because no other culture, again, anywhere else ever in history, including European culture, has had that, and it does not match the majority of people's experiences who've had them today. So you go to a real place, and there is real dimensionality to it. I don't want to say physicality. There's real dimensionality and real topography. And I also think that we can, on an intentional basis, at least, come back.
I like the way you put that. You're going back to an actual place, not just as a light photon or,
Yeah, and that's literally 19th century nonsense. Yeah, it's 19th century nonsense. It doesn't match the data. It doesn't match it doesn't match any spiritual belief system around the world at all. And it also doesn't match spirit encounters. Like, I've had after-death communication with my grandfather, and he didn't say, by the way, I dissolved into a white light, and everyone's just kind of this light. And God is also that light, and I'm really bored. He didn't say that because that would be boring. Like it was still the person that was my grandfather. And that's the case for anyone who's listening who's had those encounters. That's the case for literally everyone who's listening. No one has come back and said, I dissolved into a white light and I'm really bored now.
Don't turn off the light.
Yeah.
Have you heard the saying before where people like, don't go to the light when you pass because it's a trap?
I haven't heard that one. But yeah, you hear some weird stuff on the internet. That's interesting. I don't think it is.
You didn't know everything's true on the internet?
Yeah, I don't think it is, but I also don't think it is, because I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Gregory Shushan, but he has a book called Conceptions of the Afterlife in Ancient Civilizations. Really fascinating guy. And he basically looked at ancient Egypt, ancient Sumer, ancient China, and sort of Vedic beliefs and so on. And he matched those stories to what we know from parapsychology to do with going towards the light and the life review and all this kind of stuff. And he said this, it appears kind of like in a Witzel sense that these cultures are describing the same thing, because what is the weighing of the heart but a life review? Right? It's actually the same thing that we're seeing now. So the kind of conclusion, if you want to call it that, of the book is that what we currently describe with parapsychology was experienced by people at 3500 BC, at 2800 BC, and now it's just obviously they're framing it differently because they're in different cultures and so on. But he did this kind of survey of afterlife beliefs around the world, and they essentially, I don't want to say match because I don't want people to think we're talking about the same thing, like all cultures are the same, but they are definitely describing the same sort of consciousness process, the tunnel, the life review, the relatives, and so on. That shape is there around the world going back thousands of years, and I think that's pretty good evidence, if people like that sort of thing, that it has a specific reality to it.
Wow, that was a great way to put it. Much appreciated. This question is, this person asked like 3 times, I just noticed here. So the live chat's pretty hopping here. It's going so fast, I had to scroll back. Is DMT used in magic?
Sure. I mean, it's the active ingredient in ayahuasca. So if you're in the Amazon or in a Santo Daime church and those are essentially magical rituals, then yes, it absolutely is. If you were talking about, you know, modern Western versions of it, yeah, I have friends who, I won't specify where they are in the world or their names or anything, but I have a few friends at various places in the world who take these things in a ritual space, in a place of sort of respect, and not just doing it to party or get off your face or so on. So yes, DMT is an active ingredient. It's used in traditional culture, DMT on its own, like if you're talking about smoking it and so on, used less often. I think most commonly in modern Western magic, at least for the people that I associate with, you're in more of a psilocybin town. But yes, short answer.
Appreciate that. And ladies and gentlemen, check out Rune Soup, RUNE soup.com. Gordon White, he has an awesome blog there, a ton of information. And I've noticed that the chat and the live audience has actually grown, and it keeps growing and growing and growing the longer we stay on here. So if we did a 24-hour marathon, would have 500,000 people. Although I know you've got a ton of stuff going on, and I know that you're extremely busy, and I feel fortunate to speak with you. You were going to be on yesterday, but it was my fault. The time issues got messed up. You're on the other side of the world.
Yeah, it's what we do.
Yeah, it happens, and I appreciate you coming on today. Would you like to share a couple other gems with us, or what would you like to share with us in closing that can help enlighten those out there and find that opportunity to take it to the next level?
Ooh, I don't know. I guess check out. I have a weekly show as well, so I'm familiar with like sometimes getting the times wrong because it happens to everyone. It's my own fault for living here. I'm on the other side of the world for most of my guests. I don't know. Check out the site and have a listen to some of the previous guests, because obviously the show is sort of stuff I find interesting and useful from a magical perspective. But if you listen to this and thinking, gosh, I'm resonating with it, like I might be into the idea of magic, I'd say start with the Chaos Protocols, which is one of the 3 books I described before, because you can kind of pick that one up and run with it, and if you're into it, you can explore the other ones and go from there. But yeah, Chaos Protocols, runesoup.com. That's me.
Nice. I can't wait to get my autographed copy. Oh, wait. Dang it. Autograph.
Yeah. No. I can have my publishers autograph it, but yes, it comes from England and I'm no longer there anymore.
But you're the legend, man. You're the anyway. I'm joking, but I do appreciate just the opportunity. I can't wait to get my copy. And ladies and gentlemen, check out runesoup.com. Gordon White, this guy is amazing. And like, I'm thinking of all the different things that you've said, Gordon, during this podcast that have really connected something for me. And there were several that really hit home and very positive. Nothing but good things in the chat here, which is interesting because there's usually at least a couple trolls out there. You know, you could be like, there's literally somebody that trolled me the other day because I was talking about organic food and I was saying I think organic's better than putting glyphosate all over you. And they're like, well, man, you know, you're getting feces on your food, man. What do you think about that? Well, hey, man, go get a can of Rage, spray it all over that apple, and then just take a nice big bite, buddy.
Yeah.
The
internet.
Gotta love it.
Can't live without it. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Even the trolls out there, you know, unless they're really, really bad.
Whatever. It adds flavor.
It does. And you got to have flavor. So, ladies and gentlemen, be excellent to each other. Thank you, everybody, for being here. RuneSoup.com. Also, check out LeakProject.com. Become a premium member today. YouTube.com/Clandestine Time Lord. Click that subscribe button. Be excellent to each other and be the change you want to see.
And use this process of kind of removing or striking out some of the letters and then activating the subsequent sigil or little pictogram that you make. And so that's a good example of the iconoclasm, because if you look back at, say, Northwest European magic over the previous centuries, creations of similar things like astrological talismans and so on require a lot of things that the general idea behind chaos magic was, well, dispense with it. So do I actually need gold to make a talisman of the sun? And do I actually need mercury to make a talisman of mercury and all that kind of stuff? And it seems to work. It works differently, but that's the kind of idea of what, that's the ethos behind chaos magic and I think the bit that people fail to consider is, if you don't get the results, you have to kind of go backwards and say, okay, well, maybe there is a part of the system or a part of the process that is in fact essential to it. So it's almost like experimental cooking or experimental archaeology or something. But sigil magic kind of is its defining. I mean, there are plenty of other things, but that's what it's known for, and it's also a very good example of the stripped down iconoclasm that you find in it.
Well, I'm muted, aren't I? Hello.
You are. Yeah.
You were supposed to read my lips, ladies and gentlemen. They're like, we know what he's saying. We've watched enough of these podcasts. Okay, so I was discussing how sigils, when I used to really be into creation of sigils and doing specific mantras, I read that you weren't supposed to use the vowels and second letters and stuff like that, and you combine everything into a formula. And it's interesting how effective they can be. I find it fascinating. So I think you interpreted that very well. And, you know, one thing that I think would be a huge discussion point that a lot of people I know are going to want to hear about, including myself, is the house of the dragon. You've done some serious research and you've gone very far back. So let's talk about that mythos and what the dragon actually is.
Yeah, so in Starships, I relied heavily on the work of a Harvard Indologist by the name of Dr. Witzel. And he came up with this scheme, and it's one of those remarkable things that it's almost a new, I don't want to damn it with faint praise or anything. It's almost like a new golden bough or something. It's the kind of thing you can only do at the end of your academic career, which is to build this giant meta schema and the world of that potential reorganization out of a Paleolithic mode into a more organized one that has things like kingship and more of a social stratification in that sense. So the dragon is fascinating because it's almost the forgotten notion that the universe is in fact alive.
You brought up Tiamat, and I remember reading the creation mythos of these. Tiamat is discussed, and there's this layer of Tiamat, and some people think that's the planet. And then, so you're saying you feel that's more of like a water animal or a large creature?
Tiamat's interesting because it's kind of like the cleanest. The thing about Sumerian mythology is we don't have that much in the way of contemporaneous Sumerian mythological stories. We have Babylonian survivals of them or whatever. So they're about 1,000 years later, but we can kind of guess at about a 3,500 BC. That's where they fade from view at 3,500 BC. The thing about that is, if you look at the archaeology of the general area, the cultures that we call Sumerian are much older than that. And it seems that they are, in fact, in some way, shape, or form, a kind of pre-Ice Age culture. And there are, in fact, quite a few of them around the world. This is what my book, Starships, is about. So we don't really know how far back it goes. But when it comes to whether it means, this is the challenge with looking at astrotheology. Because of that, when we get to the kind of alternate history mania of the 20th century, so Zechariah Sitchin and so on, they're looking at these stories. And these stories are associated with the stars because we get at least one current of European astrology from the Mesopotamian line. We also get it through Egypt, right? And it kind of blends in the Eastern Mediterranean in the first few centuries AD. And we also have these very large numbers. And that's where I think we kind of went awry by taking these things literally, because the numbers, and I go through this in the book in Starships, right? If you look at the kings, all have processional numbers. So the first Sumerian king ruled for 28,800 years, which goes into the kind of giant Vedic number 150 times. And then you kind of have different versions of it. So 86,400, 36,000 years, 36 is a decanic number. And so you have this kind of even division. And what that suggests is this idea that they're talking mythologically rather than literally. And bear in mind, when his book on the origins of the world's mythologies is exactly that. After sort of 50 years of working in Vedic mythology and all this kind of stuff, he realized that you can probably do like a family tree of different motifs that appear around the world in mythology. So world egg, the separation of, Father Heaven and Mother Earth, killing the dragon, the flood, the apocalypse, all these different motifs that recur all over the world. Because if you look through, say, alternate history or alternate research or so on, they kind of just play bingo up and down the timeline with motifs and say, and therefore the queen is a lizard or something. But if you actually look at it, what Dr. Witzel showed, I think, and he was very humble about it and said, look, this is a first guess. It's the beginning of a new way of kind of looking at mythology, so some of it's going to be wrong. But he managed to kind of go backwards, potentially to beyond 65,000 years ago, by sort of climbing up the family tree of these different motifs. And one of the earliest ones, so probably at a time depth of about 65,000 years ago, is some form of dragon or large monster, like mother monster, like Tiamat, and in particular the killing of it by a culture hero. And there are a number of, and this is, if you think about how family trees work, this is a very good, I don't even want to call it a guess. The hypothesis is this is why you find the dragon motif covering most of the planet, because at 65,000 years ago, if you consider the human population of the planet out of Africa between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, if you can find some beliefs that they would have held, then it stands to reason that they would take them with them as they populated the earth. So that's his idea of how old the dragon is and kind of why we see it so, everywhere around the world. And as to what the dragon represents, well, that's even more interesting. And these are sort of guesses, right? There is, if you consider, say, Marduk and Tiamat, something about what you tend to find is that this giant monster or dragon is carved up and rearranged, and the culture hero makes the entire universe out of it. So it's quite possible that with the dragon, what you are seeing is the idea of a living universe that then is kind of like rearranged by a new political system. And given that the majority of the time, and this is where it gets really tenuous, right? But given that the majority of the times the dragon is, or the mother of dragons or the mother of monsters is female, and the culture hero is typically male, that there is some suggestion that you kind of have remembered in the mythology around them. It's a modern Western form of magic that emerged in mostly North London in the mid-80s, at a time when the general magical world was quite moribund. On the sort of thelemic side, there was what usually happens with occultists is sort of ongoing arguments and all this kind of thing, and it kind of staggered out of the 70s with fights among the Thelemites and a lot of kind of Age of Aquarius nonsense. And so this sort of group of practical magicians in North London were looking at what kind of iconoclastic ways of exploring which parts work, which parts you don't need, and so on. And it has a kind of spooky name because it's called chaos magic, right? But this is the fault of Peter J. Carroll, who is one of its founders. And at the time, with people who are out there old enough will remember, there was the sort of first popular mathematics book about chaos theory. It was called Chaos by James Gleick, and it had just come out. And that kind of idea of looking at probability and fractals and so on, it kind of inspired them to say, well, are there empirical modes that we can adopt to see what works in magic and what doesn't, and so on. So it had it was hyper-focused in the same way the sort of English cunning traditions were in achieving practical results, rather than the mysticism that you get with more of a Golden Dawn approach. So that's generally the story of chaos magic. And Pete in particular published a few books, which were then picked up by Weiser, which is of course a US publisher. And that kind of, it was big in the 90s as a result when once it reached American shores. And it has some very good points to it. And like all of these systems, it has some shortcomings. But yeah, that's chaos magic. It's a somewhat iconoclastic approach to practical enchantment that has a hyper focus on results for better or for worse.
Give us a quick example, if you would.
Goodness. Well, I guess it's the practical enchantment system that it's known most for is essentially sigil magic and its own particular version of it. Because when you talk about sigils and magic, you can go back 50,000 years to cave paintings, essentially, because with a cave painting, what you were doing is encoding or physically describing a concept or a state that you want. So the chaos magic approach to sigils, principally pioneered by Pete, is inspired by the work of a early 20th century London artist called Austin Osman Spare. And you essentially kind of create statements of intent.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rex Bear Leak Project. How the heck are you? Stand by. I just have to hit the mute button here. Otherwise, we're going to get an echo. We have the man, the legend, the way of life, Mr. Gordon White himself. Really excited to speak with him. And I've noticed that we've already got a huge live audience here that's excited to hear what you have to say. You've got a really cool site. And one of the things I like about you, Gordon, is you're a deep researcher. We're going to get into multiple topics today. Oh, you hear that, ladies and gentlemen? That was an advertisement came on. I need to hit the skip button here on that. So apologize. I told you guys that there was going to be that noise there. But there is a really cool commercial on right now. If you guys want to watch it, I would definitely recommend. Just joking. Just joking. All right. So here's what we're going to talk about today, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get into the House of the Dragon. How far back does that go? What is the dragon? What is the mythology to that? We're going to talk about chaos magic and what it actually is. How do you get proven results with the craft? What about Solomon, King Solomon, Solomonian magic? I might have said that wrong. The Keys of Solomon. A lot to discuss. We're also going to get into the ancient Mesopotamian creation story and how it compares to the Nordic mythos and other creation stories as well. So it's an honor to speak with you, Gordon. How the heck are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Last time you were on the show, we definitely shattered some paradigms. You brought a lot to the table. And I feel that this one's going to be just as good, if not even better, because every time we've talked, there's just been something new presented. So let's, for the audience, because the channel's grown a little bit since we talked last, and not everybody knows about you and your story. So tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. Yes, my name's Gordon. I run a website and weekly podcast called Rune Soup. And I have, in the last year and a bit, published 3 books. One's called Starships, A Prehistory of the Spirits, which probably has some of the draconian stuff you're referring to. Another book, Chaos Protocols, which is a practical magic book, and a third one which is called Pieces of Eight, which is a specifically chaos magic book. And I born and raised Australian. I've lived in New Zealand and the UK, back in Australia now. What else? Just bought a farm, so I'm moving to southern Tasmania next year. That's me. I'm a author and podcaster and chaos magician, and researcher and speaker, and a triple threat all around.
Full threat. Right on. So what is a chaos magician? What is your definition of chaos magic?
Chaos magic is a sort of